Hello everyone, welcome back to Literary Criticism and Theory. Today we are going to examine Aristotle's observations on poetry. He discusses poetry under three heads: the nature of poetry, the function of poetry, and the emotional appeal of poetry. Let us examine the nature of poetry according to Aristotle. He tells about mimesis. Mimesis means imitation. When we discussed Plato, we have learned about his observations on art. According to him, all artistic creations are imitations. Mimesis. Aristotle was a disciple of Plato. Aristotle agrees with Plato that art is an imitation or it is mimetic. Aristotle says that art, or rather poetry, imitates three things. What are these three things? 1. Things as they are or were, or things in present or past. For example, a poet writing a poem about a tree in his garden. He is imitating it. Or a poet writing a poem about a tree which once existed in his garden. So here the poet is trying to imitate the present or past, things as they are or things as they were. Then, secondly, things as they are said to be or thought to be. For example, a poet writing about a tree in his friend's garden, which he has not seen. He is imitating from what is said about it, or he is imitating from what he thought about it. So the second one is things as they are said to be or thought to be. The writer is writing from his imagination, imitating his imagination. Third one, things as they ought to be. Ought to be means how it should be, the ideal one. For example, a poet imitates an ideal tree that should be in his garden. So these are the three things that the poetry or any art imitates, that things as they are or things as they were, the past or present, then things as they are said or thought to be, thirdly, things as they are out to be. These are the three things that poetry or any art imitates. In other words, he imitates what is past or present, what is commonly believed, and what is ideal. Aristotle goes on to say that there is a natural pleasure in imitation, which is an inborn instinct in man. So, why should a poet imitate? The reason is that there is a natural pleasure in imitation. That is an inherent property of human beings. It is this pleasure in imitation that enables the child to learn his earliest lessons in speech and conduct from those around him, because there is a pleasure in doing so. We know that a kid learns about the language, the rules of the language, the behavior by imitating others. When we see this imitation, it gives us pleasure as well. However, Aristotle does not believe, like Plato, that art is twice removed from reality and it is not to be trusted. Instead, Aristotle believes that art reveals permanent and universal truth. This art can be always be replaced with poetry. art or poetry reveals permanent and universal truths. Here he offers a comparison between uh, a poet and a historian. A historian tells what happened in the past. A poet tells what may or what ought to happen. So, a very important uh, observation about historian. Historian tells about the past, but poet tells about what may or what ought to happen. One tells about the past, other the other one tells about the future. For example, you may define it like that: what may happen or what ought to happen. Poetry, therefore, is more philosophical and a higher thing than history, because history expresses the particular while poetry tends to express the universal. Universal means something that exists alike in whatever part of the world, in whatever culture, in whatever language. Therefore, the picture of poetry places all and at all times. So, that is about the nature of poetry. And then the function of poetry. What is the purpose? What is the function of poetry? Plato is of the opinion that the purpose of imitation in art should be to teach something to the society. But Aristotle believes that purpose of art is to give pleasure. That is the primary importance. However, he is not ruling out teaching. If it is able to teach anything, it is good. Such art will be superior. That is, Aristotle is of the opinion that the primary purpose of art is to please, give pleasure. If the particular artwork or poetry is able to teach as well along with the pleasure, it will be a superior art. However, Aristotle says that the primarily art is meant for, or poetry is meant for, pleasure. Now about the emotional appeal of poetry. Plato believed that the emotional appeal of art or poetry is not good to the individual's personality. However, Aristotle disagrees with this. We know that Plato is anti-poetic in his nature. He says that the emotions aroused by the artwork will help the individual to give out the excess emotions collected in his or her mind. This process of releasing the excess emotions accumulated in the mind by means of enjoying an artwork is described by Aristotle as catharsis or purgation. We have already discussed that when we discussed about the observations on tragedy. So he says that tragedy is considered as a form of poetry. So poetry can also create catharsis in human being. Catharsis means the releasing of the excess emotions in our mind. It will make our mind healthy. Aristotle says, when a person watches a tragedy, it will arouse his grief. He may cry. This will make a person psychologically healthy, as it will release the excess emotions accumulated in his mind. So these are the three observations that Aristotle makes about poetry. One is the nature of poetry, in which he says that poetry is an imitation. Poetry imitates three things: things as they are or were, things they ought to be, uh, things they are thought to be, and thirdly, things as they ought to be. Then comparison between historian and poet. Then about the function of poetry, that is the primarily it should be function is to give pleasure, but he is not ruling out teaching. If it is able to give both, it is good. Emotional appeal of poetry, and the poetry is or poetry or tragedy or artwork is helpful to the individual because it will help the person to release his mind, the excess emotions in his mind. So these are Aristotle's observations on poetry. So we are stopping here. Thank you.